I work in a CAT team. A CAT team means essentially not a cat and a dog. It means a customer advisory team. And what we do within the customer advisory team is that we help our customers to adapt new technologies. We help the customers to, if there's an escalations, that we are the guys who are actually handling that. You might actually mention, consider the CAT team as a product group or the R&D or the Redmond's consulting team. I used to do a consulting for 8 years before actually moving into the Office 365 engineering. There's my Twitter addresses and emails, but for the emails and all of that, so if you have any questions, please don't send me an email. Please use our Office 365 Patterns and Practices Yammer group for that, because that's a super technology and super platform so that the other people can actually see the question and the answer as well. So we don't have to do one-to-one teaching and answering on the questions, rather to utilize the Yammer for that. Nowadays, what I do for a living is that I lead the program called Office 365 Developer Patterns and Practices. That was a program which was originally named something completely different. The whole idea of the program was that we actually wanted to start sharing knowledge of kind of a typical customization and knowledge how to do transformation to the app model, or how to implement stuff using SharePoint app model. It's not necessarily just transformation. It's all about how do I enable a certain functionality within the Office 365. And then at some point, marketing people loved the idea, and then they wanted to rename the program as Office 365 Patterns and Practices, which is fine, and I don't actually mind at all. Just to explain the history of that program as well. I do also work in quite a few other internal programs where we help our biggest customers do the transition from the full source code to the app model. So we do have quite a few big customers right now in Office 365 dedicated platform where we use the support full source code. But now in the dedicated platform as well, the next version of the dedicated platform is only supporting the app model. And let's talk about the on-premises impact and all of that during this presentation as well. But really, before we go to the actual session itself, I just want to do small marketing. Office 365 Developer Patterns and Practices, aka MS Office Dev PnP. That's the location and address to find videos, samples, code, a humongous amount of examples and guidance on how to do app model implementations. Right now, our landing page is pointing already to the dev.office.com, and there's quite a lot of additional stuff in MSDN as well. So really nice set of addresses to remember whenever you actually need to start working on this topic. Good, moving on today's agenda, to this session. So the whole topic of this one is the transformation to the app model. So what does it actually mean? Let's have a chat about that one. What do we actually need to think through? Do we have tools what we can actually just run our full source code and magically poof, there will be app model implementation? Or what is actually the process of doing that? We will talk about the guidance for the transformation. So how should be approaching these projects? Right now, we're assuming or expecting quite a significant amount of on-premises customers gradually starting looking into app model technologies with the SharePoint 2016, and also the fact that if they want to go to the cloud, they need to get rid of the full source code. So they need to start re-implementing, or they need to re-implement some of this stuff using then the app model functionality. So let's have a talk about that one. Then we will have a talk about the transforming the typical SharePoint customizations or functionalities. There will be a separate sessions for site provisioning, essentially talk about site templates and how to do that stuff using the app model. That's on Wednesday. And the branding is something what we're not going to actually cover too much in this session either, because we have a session coming on branding topics tomorrow. But other things like timer jobs. Quite typically, as a full source code developer, as a farm solutions, you might have timer jobs and other functionalities. How can I actually implement them using the app model techniques? And what is the process of aligning to that one? I will have also 3 demos, so let's have a look about really the code as well, how things actually work and how we can actually make typical functionalities enabled using the app model techniques. Good, let's actually get started. I wanted to do kind of a slightly different deck and different presentation this time. So this is not really about the bullet points. What I wanted to go through is let's say, typical statements, what people are hearing and telling whenever we actually talk about the transformation or about the app model. As an example, we just wanted to really, as an example, this slide is a good example where we want to really clearly say that whenever we do the transformation to the app model, it is actually a rewrite. There's no marketing way of making that any prettier, because when you think about transformation from the farm solutions to the app model, you have server-side code, and then you need to actually implement that using alternative means. And usually that server-side code doesn't actually play because it's server-side SharePoint code. You cannot run that within the Azure or Microsoft Azure. You can absolutely take the functionality and the business logic and the process, whatever the code is doing, and adapting that one. But technically, this is actually a rewrite. So we need to start not necessarily from scratch. We need to start thinking the implementation in a slightly different way. But really, when you think of it, it's all about taking the learnings of the functionality and then moving that functionality implementation to the app model techniques. It's no longer then timed jobs, it's no longer event receivers, it's no longer web parts maybe, but the functionality could be still exactly the same. It's really about implementing this stuff using alternative solution, the same functionality from an end user perspective. And what's really cool, what we're seeing with many of the customers who are moving on and doing this transformation, the end users don't even necessarily understand that the UI or the implementation has been completely transformed. The implementation in behind has been changed. The functionality might have been changed, how do we provision sites or site collections. But the UI, the end user experience, is exactly the same. It really comes down on just implementing the same end user experience in a slightly different way. And we're going to talk about those during the demos as well. Common question what we got, common question what we're having all the time is that don't we actually have a tool to help to integrate the code, or migrate the code, or transform the code? And theoretically, yes, maybe, theoretically, you could actually implement a tool which is doing some form of a transformation from the server-side code to the app model. But typically, this is not about actually one-to-one transformation. The fact is that quite often, whenever you had a web part in a full trust code or a farm solution, it's not quite often actually even an app part in the app model implementation. It might be completely different. So we cannot actually do the automation as such by running a code against some engine, and it would actually come up with a web part equals app part, or whatever the logic is. And quite often, actually, like in the case of something typical, the OneDrive for Business, the My Site branding, it's a really good example. Every single on-premises deployment wants to have their My Site quite often as a custom-branded UI. There's some customer-specific requirements. We used to take advantage of a feature stapling. We don't have a feature stapling in that model. So we need to come up with an alternative way of them implementing that same functionality, which I'm going to show later today. And then whenever we're showing those and have that discussion, then the following quote is always that, wait, so you actually are saying that I need to throw everything away and start from scratch. Technically, that's actually kind of accurate. But in reality, it's the functionality and the process and the business logic which has actually taken the long time to even implement in a server-side code. The technology is quite often the easiest part. Thinking through what the customer needs to have and implementing the business logic behind of the server-side code is actually the much more, let's say, time-consuming and resource-intensive part. Understanding the business requirements and the functional requirements. But it is true, at some level, the technical implementation has to be transformed. And let's talk about that one during the demos as well, slightly more. When you think of it, especially when we start to think about the typical projects, the actual coding of the implementation of the coding or the customization, is that really the main time-consuming part? It could be quite a significant part, but quite often actually during the implementation you will realize that, well, maybe the initial thinking was slightly way, I need to do the business logic and the functional requirement in a certain other way. Now you have all of that knowledge already whenever you want to do the transformation to the app model. So you can concentrate away from those learnings, and you absolutely understand how the functionality should actually work. This is just a 5-level steps of a transformation process, what we're doing for our own projects. So we're running this JDP program for our Office 365 dedicated customers. And there's 36 of the biggest customers we have. And we come up with a 5 steps process, which is actually helping us on doing the transformation. And we really want to, well, we were repeating this to every single customers, and they seem to be extremely happy about the process. And we're going to release the process itself and the documentation and guidance and templates and all of that in MSDN pretty soon as well. But what we learned from all of this is that the number one thing when we get started is actually the readiness. We need to make sure that the customer and the implementation people, the developer, actually understand what is an app model. That they don't just think that the app model means an app part. It's much more than that. It's a humongous amount of more than that. And it's really level setting, making sure that everybody who has to be involved within the project are on the same table and understand what are we actually talking, what's actually possible with the app model technologies. The second stage is the assessment, and this is where we do have third-party tooling available, like the SPCAF is a good tool, available for analyzing the existing farm solutions, analyzing the existing implementation. But the reality is that the existing implementation is not actually the most interesting part. The functionality and the business requirements behind of that implementation is much more interesting. So the code itself is not really the thing what we should be looking. We should be looking what does the server-side code actually is enabling. What is the functionality what the server-side code is doing, rather than just concentrating on the app part or web part equals an app part thinking, because that doesn't really work. Then after that, what we do with the customers is the planning stage, and this is where we do the initial analysis or initial planning on the app model version. So how we would be actually implementing these typical customizations or the customization what the customer needs to have using then the app model techniques. And after this, we can actually do pretty accurate estimates. So quite often what we do is that we repeat these 3 steps to every single customer, and at that point we're able to then do the proper estimates on the actual implementation and enabling that functionality within the cloud or within the app model in general. Then obviously we have the actual implementation where we do the stuff, we implement whatever Azure WebJobs, whatever functionalities, whatever is needed actually for the customer. And then the final piece, which is the deployment. So we deploy the app to the environment, and we need to remember one really critical thing, which is the second bullet point on that box, which is the existing content retrofitting or transformation. Like in the case of Office 365 Dedicated, whenever we are using content database attach for moving between the environments. What it means is that if the content, the farm solutions have to be completely cleaned from the content database before we can actually move to another environment, because otherwise the new environment will have issues related on code which doesn't exist, and there was a dependencies on the full code. And what I mean with that one is that we really need to go through individual site collections and sites and make sure that, for example, if there's master pages which are pointing to the 15 Hive, we actually point the master pages to the style library or the master page gallery within the site collection level. So we kind of fix the sites one by one to be app model compliant, so to say, without any dependencies on a full code. And there will be a lot more guidance in MSDN coming up on these topics later. This is also a common statement that the app model is only patterned for cloud. It's not for on-premises. But the reality is what we want to do, especially with the new versions in SharePoint 2016, is really make the app model vibrant and really the development platform into on-premises as well. And the whole point and the thinking is that then you implement once in the on-premises or in the cloud, and the same implementation works in the on-premises as well, or the other way, wherever you actually are targeting. So one implementation, so you don't actually think about the cloud as an exception, because really it is not an exception. And where we want to be is that even the customer is actually right now in on-premises, we really want to make sure that we implement that stuff in a way that what if they want to move to the cloud within the next year? Who knows? Or within the 2 years. It would be an awkward and nasty discussion to then say that, well, the implementation what we had, that was full code, so now we need to do a significant investment again to clean up that one and transform that to the app model. But obviously, it depends also on the business requirements. This is not a yes or no answer, a yes or no discussion. Absolutely, you can still do an alternative technologies as well. One thing what we also what I wanted to be really clear is that what do we mean with the app model technology? So when you think about the app model, in our terminology, in the Microsoft terminology, if you think about customization options, we have the full source code option, which is the first one on the slide. That's pretty typical. We understand what it actually means. It's server-side, it's running on the SharePoint server. That's not supported in Office 365 and never will be. We cannot actually support that because it's full source code. The middle section is kind of an interesting part. On the right side, we have the store apps. That's the typical apps which people can go and install from the SharePoint App Store, or whatever we actually call that Office Marketplace now. The middle section is actually the most interesting part, because people quite often, they think about the app model in a way that I always need to install an app to the site. And that's not actually what it means. Quite often what we see with these customers is that it's not even, we have sites and customers who don't actually have any actual SharePoint app parts or apps to be installed on the site. What we do is that we remotely configure the site. So it could be, for example, self-service site collection provisioning, where the people go and they request a site. Well, as part of the site request and creation of the site, we actually apply the needed branding, we apply needed configuration. Nobody is actually installing any apps to the site as such. And that's a really kind of the growing part of the app model thinking. And when we think about the app model in our terminology, it's actually both. It's anything what's actually happening outside of the SharePoint context. Remote APIs and also the remote configuration on the existing site. And that's definitely the growing part of things. If you're a SharePoint App Store developer, that's absolutely an option in the future as well. And that's a growing theme as well. But quite often, when we think about the transformation from the farm solutions to the app model, we kind of miss that middle section. We can do a lot of stuff using the remote APIs and configuring the sites. And that's something, obviously, which I'm going to demonstrate today quite heavily. So let's have a quick first demo related on JS embedding. This used to be actually called, I'm just being honest, terminology was JavaScript injection. Then somebody said, well, the injection sounds pretty bad. So let's actually change the name to be JavaScript embedding. Either way, I'll show you the functionality and you'll understand what I'm actually meaning with that one. Injection has a slightly different, let's say, angle. Every single time if somebody says injection, it sounds bad. If you say embedding, it doesn't sound that bad. So this is one of the BNP examples, Office 365 patterns and practices examples, and this is a really typical Office 365 patterns and practices sample. I'm going to quickly zoom in here. So we do have, this one actually has a dependency on core component. I'm not going to actually go to do detail on that one in this session. We have documentation for the sample. There's the SharePoint project, which is introducing the SharePoint app itself, and this is a provider-hosted application. So it's actually, that's the web provider-hosted application side of the sample. In this particular case, I'm actually deploying this app to the site. But just as well, we could run this code using a console application or PowerShell or whatever we want. I'm just using this as a simple example, pressing F5, and then we can actually test how the functionality works. This is also a really typical patterns and practices example because this is not really flashy. Well, it's flashy when I press a button. But the whole point of our guidance and these things are that you can easily download these samples down, and then they concentrate on showing one thing and one or two things. So you can easily adapt the core functionality. It's not really like the keynote demos, which are flashy and they look awesome, and then when you pull that code down, you don't understand a thing because it's way too complex. So the BNP stuff is more as stepping stones. It's trying to help you to learn those key topics and key functionalities on the way to the cloud. So today we're going to do the scenario one, and this is just the basic JavaScript customization, but I'm going to walk through what's actually happening. I'm going to first show what's actually happening. So I'm going to jump on the dev site. So this is a typical dev site collection, just making sure that there's no customization right now there, except the logo, but that's fine. And what we do within our provider-hosted application is that it's actually saying inject. I should probably update that one to be embed. But what we do is that we upload a JavaScript on the site, then we use a user custom action point to that JavaScript, and it will actually change the behavior of the site. It won't be a significant change, but it will be a change. So, and I could, as said, I could actually run this in PowerShell as well. But then now that the execution has happened, and I'm actually going to go to the site, we're seeing some, let's say, small modifications. And this is pretty small modifications, but it's actually showing the basic functionality anyway. So if nothing else, we're seeing an additional message, which is saying JavaScript customization is fun. Well, I'm not a JavaScript developer. I'm not really thinking through that it's fun. But Andrew Connell may think that JavaScript customization is fun. I'm a server-side guy, so no offense for that one. But what we're doing essentially is that we change the behavior of the site. And that's not an app. It's a user custom action. And what's happening now is that whenever I actually do an F5, our JavaScript file is executed as part of the page processing pipeline. And wherever I actually go within this site, the same behavior remains. So now if I go to the site settings, we're actually able to see the same customization. Well, actually, there's an exception for site settings. I'm going to go site contents. So it's not about in the page. It's actually in the site level. And what's also kind of an interesting, what's slightly hidden on the UI, if I scroll here, I usually would have what here? I would have create a sub-site functionality. But that's now taken away. And that's taken away by my JavaScript customization. How did we actually make this happen? So let's have a quick look on the code and just walk through what are we actually doing. Whoop. Slightly adjusting these. Let's do, there we go. So this one is taking advantage of our so-called, well, not so-called, patterns and practices core component. And what the core component is giving us is an additional extension methods so that they will increase the productivity of the developers so that you don't have to implement the typical stuff and typical code in every single project. It's a standardized component, open source component in a GitHub, which we're releasing in every monthly pages as a new GitHub package. As an example, it is, well, immediately when we have a reference to that core component, we're getting these additional extension methods. As an example, add a JS link. And so what we're going to do is that let's have a look on the add a JS link functionality, and let's go to the actual implementation. And what's happening there, just quite a few jumps. There we go. And let's do this. So what we're doing is that we are taking advantage. Well, to be honest, we're building first the JavaScript. So we're building a dynamic JavaScript, which we then add the user custom object, user custom action collection. So I'm going to actually jump on the thing. So the reason why we are creating this dynamic JavaScript in the code is that now we can point to any JavaScript in any CDN within the world. And I'll come back on that one when I show the thing in the process side. So what will happen is that we will go to the user custom action, and we're adding a user custom action to the web level. So web has a collection called user custom action, which can be used to add these user custom actions in. What will happen is that in practice, I'm going to switch to process side. Whenever I'm actually executing the page, our custom JavaScript is executed as well. So let's open up the F12 or the developer console. I'm going to quickly jump on the right file, if I can remember what the right, it's a scenario 1. So what will happen is that this code is essentially executed at the same time, every single time when the page is executed. And what the code is doing, it is first of all checking, is it well, there's exceptions, for example, for view lists. It's also adding that JavaScript message. I'm actually going to zoom in, using out-of-the-box JavaScript capabilities. So what will happen is that now every single time we will do a refresh on a page, this JavaScript will be executed, and it can do whatever it wants to do. In this case, it's only showing a JavaScript message, but it could actually throw a web control. It could throw a functionality which has a button clicks. It could be as complex thing as we want. In this particular case, as mentioned, pretty simple stuff. Tomorrow in the branding session, we're going to actually show a slightly more complex related on navigation controls using this exact same technique. Moving on the slides, just want to make sure that I don't miss the other demos as well. So it's a way of implementing, and like mentioned, in this particular case, I was clicking a button in my provider-hosted application to get the functionality into the site. But I don't have to do that as a provider-hosted application. I could install that JavaScript on the site just by running a console application, a PowerShell, or whatever is the functionality how I want to deploy my deploy that customization. Some things, I know that even the Evolution conference agenda had some wrong statements related on full trust code, because if I remember correctly, unfortunately, for the day 4, it is actually saying that the full trust code is deprecated, and that's not absolutely true. Full trust code is absolutely supported, so if you want and if you need and you want to do this full trust code in the on-premises in the future as well, feel free to do that. We will absolutely support full trust code in the SharePoint, and we're not taking that away. Because the whole product is built using full trust code solutions and feature framework. We can't actually deny that. Obviously, there has been some people has been looking into that should be deprecate that one, but it would be foolish. There's so many customizations out there. We want our people actually move to the app model, but gradually. We shouldn't be throwing the whole full trust code solution away from the product, and we never will be. So let's be really clear on this one. The full trust code solutions will be absolutely supported in SharePoint Server 2016. And they will be supported in the next SharePoint server, whatever will be released after the 2016. They're already said that they're going to do additional releases as well. I think that was last week's communication. Let's be clear on this one as well. Will we ever support farm solution in Office 365? The answer is no, we can't. The reality is that the farm solutions actually aren't deployed in the server level. Then they modify the server behavior. And in our Office 365, we have like 500 customers in a single farm. We can't really take then solutions from 500 customers and then try to somehow magically isolate them per customer. It just doesn't work like that. I saw a blog post on the internet saying that the app model is dead. I know that some of you probably have seen that blog post, but it's absolutely not true. This app model is definitely alive, and we're heavily investing on this one in the future as well. We will actually make a really interesting announcements in the Ignite in 2 weeks related on the app model and how the app model authentication model will be slightly changed. But it's nothing which would actually impact the developer as such. So that as a developer, if you're developing now app model stuff, you will be doing the exact same things. You can go to the app renew page and register a client ID and a secret. And all of that functionality will still work as such. So it's definitely the direction where we want to go. Will you introduce a replacement for the app model in the near future? This is a common discussion. You introduced a sandbox solution in 2010, and now in 2013 you introduced an app model. What will be introduced in 2016? Well, nothing. The app model is now the chosen one, so to say, and it's definitely we're 100% committed on this model. It really comes down on thinking the running the code outside of the SharePoint, running the code in a loosely coupled way and consuming the services within the SharePoint. And that's what the app model is all about. The sandbox solution story, well, that's then another discussion, which we will mention slightly later today as well. Quite often people are saying, I can't do X and Y and Z. Well, they don't say X and Y and Z, but I can do some functionality with an app model. And this is absolutely true. There are still limitations. When we think about, if we look back on the SharePoint CSAM API, we've been actually evolving that quite heavily. Was it last Friday or week before, we released the latest version for CSAM in the cloud. It has a massive amount of new APIs. And now you can actually control language settings, regional settings, auditing settings. You actually get access to logs and all of that stuff in the cloud as well, using the CSAM APIs. If we compare where we were with an RTM version, we come actually really far. Now we're able to truly build solutions, and we're able to configure these sites in a meaningful way, which is really cool. One of the good examples of the alternative thinking is the remote timer job. So timer jobs is a server-side code. It's absolutely understandable. It's a scheduled task running in the SharePoint server farm. And then you can go and say that every single 5 minutes that code will be executed. Whatever the code does, it's up to the code. If you think about the timer job as such, obviously we cannot replace the timer job because we don't have a corresponding functionality in the app model. What we can do, however, is to think about what the timer job is actually doing. It is executing code as a scheduled job outside of the SharePoint. Well, can we schedule an execution of code? Absolutely. We can do that, for example, just using Windows Scheduler. Say that every single 5 minutes execute something. Can we access the SharePoint using APIs? Yes, we can. We could even implement a PowerShell script, which is executed in every 5 minutes, and it's then using the SharePoint CSAM APIs to do some work. And it's all about just thinking through, where do I actually put that fellow to be executed? How do I actually execute that? And yes, there's still the question, is that needed API open? If your server-side timer job was manipulating administrative things, that's not obviously exposed using that model, and never will be, because we cannot allow that within the Office 365. But typically, the timer jobs are doing something like they're scanning through, for example, documents, and then they're making sure that is the document expired, or is the metadata right on the document, or is there two administrative site collection administrators in a site collection. All of those could be actually implemented using a remote timer job pattern as well. Essentially, schedule the code running outside of the SharePoint, and then it's connecting to the SharePoint. And then it's actually checking whatever has to be done using the app-only token technology. I'm going to show that one in practice as well. And then it is reporting to somebody and whatever the timer job is actually doing. So it's just thinking this in a slightly different way. And deploying the code to be executed in some other locations than actually SharePoint. So let's have a look on that one. This is the example. This is a pretty classic example, but let's do a small additional twist on that. I'm going to stop the Vesa Studio. And I'm going to jump in here. So this is a example which is called solution. Whoop, let's undock that one. There we go. Core simple timer job. And all of these are available in the GitHub for you to download and do an F5 and understand how things actually work. And they do have the README as well. So what this one is doing is that I'm actually, there's two solutions of Visual Studio solutions within the sample. The one solution is actually provider-hosted application, which I'm actually just using to give me a client ID and a secret. You can get a client ID and a secret in multiple different ways. You can go to an AppRec new page and request a client ID and a secret, and then go an app-inv ASPX page where you can access permissions to the client ID and a secret. In this particular case, what I've done is that I created provider-hosted application, which has requested certain permissions. It has requested permissions to manipulate a web, or host web using the information. And this provider-hosted application actually isn't doing anything. So this is just a UI explaining for the person who wants to learn about the functionality, how things actually work. But what we got as part of the provider-hosted application is that now we have a client ID and a secret, which have actually permissions attached to them. So these two fellows in here, I'm going to quickly zoom that bigger. There we go. Is essentially, when you think of it, oversimplifying things, and personally I love oversimplification because it usually helps people to understand what's happening. The client ID is a user ID. The secret is a password. Behind of the client ID and a secret, we have permissions in the SharePoint side. So now, as long as I take advantage of this client ID and a client secret, I can actually do whatever the permission was, which is given to this ID and a password. And really, when you think of it, security, the app authentications and all of this token and security thingy, you don't actually need to even worry about that. As long as you understood what I just mentioned. It's an ID and a secret, and behind of that one we have permissions. And you're good to go as a developer. All of that additional, let's say, things, if you really want to understand how SharePoint is implemented, you can absolutely deep dive on that security and tokens and all of that, which I don't even do. I never do because I don't have to. Client ID and a secret is only all what I need to get actually started. So what I now have, I'm going to copy the client ID and a secret. I'm going to move to my another solution. And this is actually a console application. So I'm going to quickly resize these things. So this is just a typical console application. It has some CSAM code to connect to the SharePoint. I'm going to walk through that one in a second. But what I'm going to do is that I'm going to copy that client ID and a client secret to this app config. Because now, essentially, that connection has the right permissions to operate against SharePoint. And that means that I can actually do something. Let's walk through the code quickly. I'm going to put a breakpoint in here, and we can actually see what we are doing while we're implementing. So it's a console application, and it's taking advantage of the app-only token access. What that means is that it's actually It's not an end-user operation. It's not an end-user who's in the UI and clicking the UI. Now we have that ID and a secret or the password. It is connecting to the SharePoint. And there's no user context as such. What we do here is a few lines of code, which we need to essentially repeat whenever we do an app-only token operation. I can't even remember that. I always go to the Bing, to copy that message. Damn it. And then I essentially use that within my code. So just to be clear, you don't have to memorize that stuff. But essentially what it means is that I'm going to take an app-only access to the SharePoint on the Office 365. And what I'm doing is that I'm actually accessing my own dev tenant, which is in the app settings as a configured URL. So it's actually just going to go and give me an access token. It's just a code which essentially it's calling to the SharePoint, giving that client ID and client secret, and then the SharePoint is saying back that, okay, here's a token. Whenever you operate against me, give that token as part of the request. And that's being all automatic. I don't need to worry about that one, as long as I have that right start within my code. So what this fellow is actually doing, it is checking, well, this is not a typical business case, but it's checking that do we have a list called remote operation already within the site. And it's then actually running code to create the list if it's not there. What we do with that list is something pretty simple and something not that actually, how would I put it, not that mesmerizing. We're just adding an item to that list with a timestamp. But essentially what happens now is that we're operating against the Office 365. If I go to the site contents, if I go to that remote operation list, there's my latest timestamp, which has been executed right now. Well, I'm in a finished time. That's the reason why it's in the future. And the future is bright. Good. So what happens is that now we add those additional stamps whenever we actually execute the thing. It just proves the fact that it actually can be executed remotely as completely as such. But then what we can do also is the scheduling part. So now we have the code, we have the business logic, we have connectivity working. How do we actually make this console application to be executable, whatever it's actually doing? Let's imagine that it's doing something useful. So I can just, for example, if you're in Office 365 world, you can pretty much do something like following. Publish as an Azure WebJob. Right-clicking the console application. The only thing what I need to do is then click that one. It is asking where do I actually want to publish that. I've already created an Azure website. I could actually create that dynamically using this wizard as well. And now when I click publish, it's going to copy all of that code, compile the code. It's going to put that in the Microsoft Azure. With the same ID, it's going to copy the app config there as well. So now in the Azure and in Microsoft Azure, we can go and schedule this fellow to be executed as often as we want, or as on demand, or however we want to actually implement the functionality. And let's quickly have a look on that one. So I'm jumping within my Azure site, and it's in the websites. There we go. Because it's a web job, essentially a web job is a console application. It can be also something else. But what was done was that I actually deployed a console application as a web job, and we're able to see that console application under a website and web jobs. And right here, we're able to now see that fellow, which is essentially manually scheduled. I haven't actually scheduled this one. Its scheduling is set to on demand. I could as well say that every single 5 minutes, execute this fellow. Just as well, I could change that. But this means that now I can actually do something like execute this manually on demand or as a scheduled job. And what's really cool about the web jobs as well, it's now executing the last run result is success. It's also the logging part. So within the web jobs, we have additional logging, we have additional knowledge to then give me insights how I've been executing this particular fellow, how many often there has been some failures on the previous executions. Right now, the execution is working properly. But now if everything went actually well, so this is the old exception right now, this is the 33 seconds ago implemented, it's actually executed properly, that console application executed running success. So that means that if I now go to my website and do that remote operation list, we absolutely should have an additional new entry on the list as well. which is probably that one. Well, we can't actually really understand what's happening here, so let's make sure that that's actually working properly. So what I'm actually doing is that I'm going to delete the list. But since my code is properly implemented, it's defensive code, it's going to create the list automatically as well. So now if it would be scheduled, it would eventually actually get automatically added on the site, but I'm going to go into my Azure and say run once for that web job. It's going to actually execute the code. It's enabled, initialization, there's the logs, looks good, and it's a success. So now if I go back on my site and do refresh, that remote operation list has magically reappeared. There we go, and we have one item which is actually telling that it's probably proper time. So essentially now we have an operation which doesn't require end user to do anything. We are operating against the cloud. We could do whatever we want. We could scan documents. We could go through all of the site collections and apply modifications. We could scan through all of the content types and documents and think about, let's say, workflows for the expiration of the documents or automated cleaning or check if there's 2 site collection owners for every single site collection. Typical stuff. Let's take the questions, but hold on it. Want to make sure that we have time for the slides after the session. Thank you. Good. On that particular topic, well, not precisely on other topics, we'll come back on the timer jobs and web jobs in the final demo as well, because actually the web jobs is super technology to do much more additional stuff. It's not only for scheduling, and I'm going to explain that in the final demo as well. The one point, one common discussion point when people actually start thinking about the transformation to the app model is the branding. And let me be clear on this one. There has been also confusion since our European Tech Ed presentation. People made pretty weird conclusions about that presentation. All of the same branding and capabilities what we have in the farm level code or farm solutions is absolutely supported in app model. What we've done is, from our messaging perspective, we've just said that, well, if you use a custom master page, you just need to understand what might happen if we introduce changes in the future. And we're going to talk about all of this actually tomorrow with Jeremy on the session tomorrow afternoon. So I'm not going to go too detailed on these things. You can absolutely use anyway custom master pages. You can absolutely do whatever functionality is needed using the app model as well. You're just uploading that custom master page to the site collection level, but you're not actually deploying that to the 15 Hive. What about site provisioning? This is a really classic discussion point, because actually when we do an app model implementation, it all starts from the site provisioning. The key point is actually the site provisioning, because as part of the site provisioning, we're able to push all the needed content types, site columns, lists, libraries, branding as part of the site provisioning as well. But I'm not going to actually do a demo on that one today. I'm going to do I would say, it's been quoted as a jaw-dropping demo. I can't pronounce it for some reason. My Finglish isn't good enough. Jaw-dropping demo on Wednesday, related on the site provisioning. As part of the patterns and practices guidance, we just released a massive, let's say, site provisioning engine, which will superbly help people to adapt the cloud from a template perspective. But it will be an interesting demo. Trust me, you don't want to miss that one. Wait. You mentioned something funny in a while. You said that we run and configure the sites using CSUM as part of the site provisioning. Does that mean that we don't actually do a feature framework? And it actually does. We want people to gradually move away from the sandbox solutions and the feature framework. And trust me, I was instructor in MCM program for, 4 years. And now I was teaching feature framework. And it's kind of silly that now I'm teaching people away from the feature framework. But there are, let's say, downsides and implications whenever we use a feature framework, which, well, as long as we know them, they might not be that harmful. But using the CSUM operation and creating those objects remotely to the cloud, using just remote APIs, will mean that you don't have dependencies on any random XML files, which nobody can understand anyway. Well, nowadays there's quite a lot of people who can, which is kind of silly that now we're moving away from the feature framework. But when I think of it, feature framework was introduced in SharePoint 2007. It's been now, 9 years since we released the feature framework? It's pretty much about time to move on to the following stage and think about these things in a slightly different way. One of the things what I also wanted to kind of pinpoint is that quite often we hear that you cannot do things using the app model. We've been working with these larger customers in the Office 365 dedicated space, and what we're seeing is that pretty much 90% of the functionalities can be actually done. It's all about thinking through a slightly different perspective. Okay, we cannot do feature framework stapling for the My Sites, but let's do something else. We cannot do on-net XML or site definitions for sites, but let's do something else. It's thinking through those individual patterns and alternative solutions, how we actually enable the things. And right now, we already have few guidances coming out, but we have P&B guidance repo where we are actually writing recipes. And what the recipes are is that we have hired one vendor, Todd Paczynski, who is a pretty known MVP as well. He's helping on collecting what we have in P&B, and he's now helping us to write individual recipes on if you implemented something in a farm solutions, this is how you can do that in an app model way. Because it's not a one-to-one match. So they are pretty long recipes, but it's showing the different options and showing the different things what you can do if you need to move to the app model. So that should be highly helpful for everybody who's moving into this space. One of the super interesting things, and this is kind of showing what you can do with the app model and what we can do, especially in Office 365, because we don't have to get stuck on things. And I'm super excited about the WebJob and storage queue, and you can see those things in all of my demos nowadays, which is kind of a sad thing as well. But what we can do with those is that we can do asynchronous operations and long-running operations. So we don't actually steal the end user by showing a GIF animation, working on it or whatever, the GIF animation in the UI, because that's actually horrible end user experience when you think of it. As an example, the native, I think it's actually natively within the SharePoint on premises. If you go and create a site collection in out-of-the-box self-service site collection UI, it is actually showing you the GIF animation until the site collection is created. That's a horrible user experience because you're just frozen and you have to keep that window open until the site collection is actually created. And that's not good. So but we can actually do really interesting stuff within the Office 365 and Microsoft Azure, taking advantage of the things like storage queue and a WebJob. And this actually applies to many operations. So when you think about functionalities like applying customizations to the OneDrive for Business site, which I'm going to demo in a second, but it could be something completely different, something which is taking a long time, but the end user starts the operation. We can do something like following, where the customer or the end user is executing the provider-hosted application. So there's a UI, or there might be a link within the ribbon, or there might be a link within the site settings, or whatever. We click that one. That's executing the provider-hosted application code, which is adding a message with the needed information to the storage queue. It's adding a storage queue message. In my example, which we're going to have a look on a second, we're adding a message on whose OneDrive for Business site we should rebrand. As an example, obviously it's up to the business case whether we actually add to that message. But then there's a really cool connectivity between the storage queues and WebJobs. Within the Microsoft Azure, if you do the proper implementation of a WebJob and you decorate the WebJob with the 2 lines of code, your WebJob code, that console application which I just deployed, will be executed automatically immediately when this message is actually in the storage queue. I need to add 2 lines of code, and I'm not kidding. And I have this awesome asynchronous implementation way of me getting now business logic executed in WebJob initiated by the end user, and it really doesn't matter if it's a long-running operation. Because now it's an operation which is owned by the WebJob. It's already executing, that can do whatever is needed. It could copy site collections between the whatever sites and so on. And then it can actually provide a message back on the end users, or it can modify the SharePoint, whatever the WebJob is doing. Maybe just the example what I previously did was pretty simple. But let's do something related on this one, on the OneDrive for Business side. So I'm going to quickly explain how this actually works and what's really the power of the WebJobs and storage queues. So this is one of the examples, the OneDrive for Business config. And this is actually a so-called solution. What we mean with solution within the patterns and practices guidance is that it's pretty ready to go as a production-ready code. We, however, do not have an SLA, and we do not have a support system for patterns and practices guidance, so therefore we call all of them as a sample. Somebody has to take an ownership of the code. But it's an open source code, so it's a really nice setup. So what we have here is the OD4B configuration asyncs. The business case is that I need to be able to brand the My site or the OneDrive for Business site or apply configurations in OneDrive for Business sites for all of the users who I have within my company in Office 365. In our on-premises, we used farm-level stapling. We stapled a feature on the My site creation. So whenever there was a My site created, which is essentially the same as OneDrive for Business site, our feature was executed, and that could actually do some modifications. We cannot do feature stapling in the cloud. So we needed to come up with an alternative way of thinking this. So what we're doing here is that we actually take advantage of the storage queues, but we need to have a place where the end user will go to initiate this creation of the modification of the My site. And I call it My site, but it's the OneDrive for Business site. But it's the same as My site. It's highly confusing, by the way. Especially for those who haven't been a long time in a SharePoint. So those who right now joined the SharePoint area, they're like, OneDrive, My site, what are you talking? For us, maybe the old school people, it's pretty typical stuff. So this is right now my OneDrive site. It has some example files and example content. And this design works in a way that I need to have a location where my end users will land. Well, typically, every single company has their own corporate intranet. Which is typically set as a default opening page within a process, using the group policies within the company. I can see some of the, at least, people nodding. But that's the biggest thing what the enterprises are doing. Always they force all of the process to be opened up, for example, in intranet.condoso.com. So, and that's actually the switch, and that's the location where we can start the process of branding and modifying my OneDrive for Business site. So what we have here is a individual app part. Going the wrong way. So I'm going to start editing the page. What I've done is that I've installed an app, and I'm going to show you the code after the demo. An app which actually has one app part. The app part is a hidden app part. And what I mean with the hidden app part is that this doesn't actually have a UI. But what the app part is doing, it starts executing server-side code. And the only thing you can actually see that it's doing something is the working on it message in the UI, if we want. In my particular case, this is implemented in a way that it's actually showing me some debugging information. But it's giving us a good information. It's implemented in a way that it's, first of all, it's checking, do I have a cookie? Cookie means, the cookie checking is there, that it's not hitting the user profile, service application, in every single time somebody is hitting the front page. Because that would actually have a pretty significant performance hit. And so we are actually storing a cookie which is essentially saying, oh, we checked the user profile status for this guy already. Let's not do that until the cookie has expired. So there's a kind of a caching delay. Then what it did after that one, it actually accessed my user profile and checked what is my user profile URL. I'm going to show this one in the code as well. It really went to the user profile, checked that my user profile, my site actually exists, and then it actually took that URL and stored that one. And then what it did next was that it actually placed that URL in the storage queue, essentially for the web job, saying, oh, web job, here's a job, make it happen. And this operation is relatively fast. And from an end user perspective, obviously this is not good looking stuff. You don't want an end user to see this one. But in real world, what we would do is that we would actually go here, the web part properties, just to show the whole story. I'm putting height to 0 pixels, and then I'm going to do a configuration and disable the debug information. So this would be the real world case, except that I forgot to do one more thing, which is hide the title field. So after that, we don't actually see that web part at all. Chrome type is none. So that will make sure that the web part doesn't actually have a presence or UI visible in the UI. And let's do save. So now what will happen is that every single time I land on this front page, that web part or app part is executed. And the code behind of that app part is executing. And that's a good note. The placing is obviously slightly messed up because there's a wrongly implemented HTML related on the web part thingy. I should place the web part as a final person on that column. So that shouldn't, that's not then causing any visual impact. But now the end user doesn't know, but we're actually executing code in the context of the end user. And the end user does have access on his or her user profile. So what we're doing in the CSAM is that we access the user profile, we get that information, and then in the server-side code, we just add that storage queue, which is essentially saying, hey, this guy, apply branding to his OneDrive for Business site. And then on the other side, we have that web job catching that message and a task, which is then essentially catching the calls and executing the needed customization for the OneDrive for Business site. And we should have OneDrive for Business site branded. Damn it. Let's actually see what's actually happening. Interesting. So let's go one more here, just double checking what's actually happening. And there's my OneDrive for Business configurator. And underneath the WebJobs, we should have a fellow executing. It's in stopped status, so let's actually do start. The reason why it's in every now and then I'm doing stopping for this is that I don't want that code to be executed every single time, because that actually hits my Azure, and then it actually is costing some money. So it's the same thing as that you really want to shut down your VMs in Azure, because otherwise somebody has to pay for it. So now the web job is actually running. It's in running continuously status. We can actually go to the web job logs from the Azure side, so we're able to see that that execution should be already working, because the web part actually created a task to the queue, which is now in the execution. Oh, it's actually in running stage. That's the case. It's now executing that implementation. And let's wait a while. Its status is running. Most likely, if we now go to my OneDrive for Business site, we're able to already see some modifications. There we go. We're seeing actually the branded site to be completely rebranded. We have a background image. It's using a custom theme. And we also added a JavaScript using that JavaScript embedding, not JavaScript injection. Almost actually said it the wrong way again. That technique, we're adding this kind of a policy message, which is essentially saying that, okay, you're not allowed to do whatever. Up to you, what do you want to do? This is just an example how to customize the OneDrive for Business site. And then there could be a link to the company policy as an example. So in practice, what happened here, I'm going to quickly go through and step through the code, because this is superbly simple stuff in the end, even though it sounds maybe complex. But Microsoft Azure is a pretty simple thing to actually take advantage of. So let's go up first on the UI. So in our web UI, we have that web part, or app part, not web part. I should always use the same right terminology. But what do we have here? I'm going to actually hide these fellows. Is that we are running the code in the context of the user. There we go. In the context of the user, we are getting access on the profile, using the profile loader. We're getting access on my particular user's user profile personal site, a property called personal site. Essentially, that's a property which is giving us an instance to the site object, which is the OneDrive for Business site. If that particular site object doesn't exist, it means that the personal my site has not been created yet, because that's the normal case within the cloud. If it doesn't exist, I'm actually starting the creation of the personal OneDrive for Business site automatically using CSAM as well. If it does exist, what we do is that we start applying configurations to the site. And let's go quickly on that particular code. And jumping on the actual implementation. Here we go. So what we do is that we add a message to the storage queue. And really, adding a message to the storage queue is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That's 3 actual lines of code. That's a 1 line of code almost, and that's a 1 line of code. Depends how you calculate or combine the lines. But it's pretty much like 5 lines of code. As long as I have references to those right Azure DLL assemblies, I can just add a message on the storage queue. That's the UI part. That's what the app part had to do.
Then on the other side, we had the WebJob. And the cool thing about the WebJobs is that, like mentioned, you can actually hook the WebJob automatically to be executed whenever there's an item added to the storage queue. And how it works is that we need to make sure that both the UI, which is adding the item to the queue, and the WebJob is connected to the same storage queue. And we do that by making sure that our Azure WebJobs dashboard and Azure WebJobs storage connection strings are matching to the right story in the cloud. In the storage queues, there's a connectivity information, which is copy-paste that in our app config and a web config. But after that, I really need to add 2 lines of code or 1 line of code. It's this one in here which is doing actually all the magic. Let's see if I can zoom in. There we go. So the fact that I have an attribute called queueTrigger, and then I'm saying queueTrigger for certain queue name. That has to just match the queue name when I'm adding the items, when I'm actually reading. That is making sure that whenever an item is dropped on the storage queue, my code is executed. And what's actually happening here is that site modification data, which is actually including that URL of the site, which I need to modify, is passed in as an object. It was serialized to the storage queue, now it's deserialized, and I can actually access that information. So now it's up to me then to take advantage of that app-only token. Again, exactly the same thing what I did with that simplistic console application. We're getting access using the app-only token. And after that, we essentially apply certain theme settings using CSAM and applying them to the site. Obviously, whatever you need to actually do within the site level, it's up to the business case and up to the functionality. But this essentially means that we have a super powerful asynchronous way of doing operations and applying configurations to the SharePoint. If you are really into SharePoint app development, a good example actually where this is highly useful, or this model is highly useful, I'm going to actually go back 1 step. Where this is useful is that if you have a remote event, or if you have an app installed event within your app install event has a timeout. It might be some of the implementations, what we see is that whenever an app has been added to the site, it will actually modify the site in a certain way. It could create some document libraries, it could apply settings, and so on. But the app install event has a timeout. If the app install event takes more than 30 seconds, it's going to be, the SharePoint considers that app install to be failed. And it's going to re-execute the app install event. Well, how can we tackle that 30-second limit? Well, let's use the asynchronous pattern. So essentially in the app installed event, let's spin up a WebJob to be executed and to apply those configurations to the site. And then it's up to the WebJob to do whatever it wants, and as long as it actually takes, it can do whatever it wants to do. Super interesting and super powerful pattern when you think of it, which we don't have in the farm solutions as such. Obviously, in on-premises, you could have built completely different things to do something similar. But this is really sweet. Few lines of code, and we have a really extremely powerful pattern to take advantage of. Good. That was the demo. Quick summary slide, and then let's open up for questions. And if you want to go for lunch, I know that there's lunchtime. I'll be here anyway answering for questions. But what we wanted to do with this session is more about thinking through those statements. We wanted to make sure that everybody understands where we are with the app model. The farm solutions absolutely support it, but the future is within the app model, also within the on-premises. And we really want to drive that message. And using the patterns and practices guidance, you can really easily learn how to do typical functionalities and requirements of technical implementations for functional requirements. So go to that patterns and practices site and have a look on the samples that will show you how to do, for example, something like what I did with the OneDrive for Business site. There's videos which are even showing how to install that stuff in the Microsoft Azure. So you can easily learn and adapt the right way of doing stuff. We'll also release a lot of additional guidance on a process perspective, so templates, documents on the transformation process, that 5 steps, which I mentioned when we started. And really, when you think of it, like mentioned, 95% of the stuff what we see within our existing full code customers, we can pretty much do it within the app model, especially now that we are adding those new APIs all the time, more and more. So it's really, I do understand that whenever we were RTM'd with the SharePoint 2013, it felt bad. But really, this is the direction where we're heading. And we want people to jump on board and give us feedback and give us input on what do you need. Why wouldn't you actually want to go to this direction? What's missing? And I do know that it takes a while to learn and adapt to the new model. Good. I'm going to leave that slide over there, and we can open it up for the questions if there's any. But thanks for your time anyway. So feel free to walk out if you want to go for lunch as well.